Well, shutting down what they call an old oil rig is harder and more expensive than it's going to make it sound to be. As workers continue to comb beaches for the tar bars in California's Orange County after an underwater pipeline ruptured on October 2nd, another massive fossil fuel cleanup operation is just getting underway on an old 55-year-old on a 55-year-old rig that's anchored 120 miles off the coast. Um, it's a taxpayer-funded $60 million debacle that reveals just how difficult and costly it may be to shut down an aging oil rig in the Pacific Ocean and decarbonize the country's energy supply. Um, Anchored 2 miles south of Santa Barbara, the rig in question, known as Platform Holly, was built by Arco in 1966, and it was sold to Mobil in 1993. Then it was sold again to a small Colorado-based oil company called Veneco in 1997. But in 2015, a corroded onshore pipeline carrying crude oil from Holly and other nearby platforms had burst, hemorrhaging oil onto the beach and into the Pacific Ocean. And with the pipeline shuttered, Veneco declared bankruptcy back in 2017, abruptly notifying California authorities that it would abandon its leasing and letting its rig oil workers walk off the job. And faced with the risk of another leak from the abandoned rig, the California State Lands Commission had no choice but to take over the platform. Now, the situation turned out to be even worse than it seemed. A $22 million bond that Veneco previously had put up, which was essentially a security deposit intended to cover the cost of exactly the situation, was only enough to fund just about 6% of the approximately $360 million that it needed to plug Holly's 30 oil wells and properly decommission the rig. Now, Veneco wasn't managing maintenance properly the way that it should be during Holly's last years of operation, according to Seth Blackman, chief counsel of the California State Lands Commission, which meant that the pressurized gases and oil were leaking into an outer containment zone around the platform's wall. The state was forced to continuously pipe a mixture of seawater, crude oil, and highly poisonous hydrogen sulfide gas from the leaking wells into Veneco's onshore processing facility. Now, it separates the components and it incinerates the hydrogen sulfide. ExxonMobil, Holly's previous owner, had agreed to shoulder the cost of plugging the wells and decommissioning the structure, and it would have cost about $300 million, but the additional price of continuously off-gassing the oil rig Holly's hydrogen sulfide, running the processing facility, and maintaining the half-century-old oil platform in a safe condition until it could be decommissioned fell into the state. That decommissioning work, which began in late 2019, was paused for a year and a half due to COVID-19, and the work capping the wells restarted only last week. In the meantime, California had paid about $750,000 and $1 million every month to maintain the platform Holly and deal with its poisonous emissions, basically at a cost that since 2017 has added up to about $64 million. The State Lands Commission expects to finish plugging all 30 of Holly's wells within the next year and a half, according to Jennifer Lucchese, who's the agency's executive officer. But further delays are possible, and the state will pay an additional $1.5 million a month while the work is underway. Platform Holly's long-running shutdown fiasco was put into a sharp relief this year, and basically this week, after tens of thousands of gallons of oil spilled from a fractured underwater pipeline that was off the coast of Orange County. The spill in question, which has shuttered beaches and caused untold ecological damage, has reinvigorated calls to remove oil infrastructure from California's coast. It's time, once and for all, to disabuse ourselves that this has to be part of our future, the California Governor Gavin Newsom said at an October 5th news conference. California hasn't issued any new leases in state waters for 50 years. A precedent established after the disastrous 1969 oil spill that happened off of Santa Barbara. But in the federally controlled waters off of California, which began 3 miles offshore, no new leases have been issued for more than 30 years. if not longer. The Trump squatting administration made moves to reopen those areas to make more drilling in 2018. Though the California state legislators passed measures that would have made it difficult for any potential new oil platforms to operate, and courts ultimately blocked the Trump proposal. A bill introduced in Congress this past January by California Senator Dianne Feinstein and the California Representative Jared Huffman, they proposed it basically proposes to permanently ban federal offshore leases off the coast of California as well as off of Oregon and Washington. But for Californians who want to end periodic fossil fuel disasters off their coast and draw down the state's carbon emissions, such a ban wouldn't address the roots of the problem. The 26 Asian oil rigs in state and federal waters on California's continental shelf. The opponents say those rigs and their pipelines, many of them are still operational years beyond their planned lifespans, and the disasters are waiting to happen. When there's drilling, there will be spilling. Alan Lowenthal, a Democratic House representative from the area that was affected by the Orange County spill, said in October 5th, speaking alongside Newsom, "We have to come up with a plan to not only stop new drilling, but to figure out how do we do all the drilling, and how it's not going to spill out into California." But Newsom has said that he wants to end drilling offshore and on land, and in California by 2045. While the U.S. Interior Department's Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement had announced this July that it was working on a decommissioning process for 8 defunct oil platforms that are on expired federal leases off the California coast. But as the Platform Holly debacle is showing, getting rigs out of West Coast waters may be harder than it seems. There are currently 15 other rigs in federal waters and 3 more in state waters, and there's no easy way to get them out of the ocean since their original leases often give their owners the right to continue operating as long as the platforms are pulling up oil. And when their leases are up, offshore oil companies are usually required to pay the full cost to cap their oil wells and disassemble the rigs and restore the seafloor to its prior condition. But that expensive obligation doesn't kick in until the underground reservoirs functionally run dry. So companies tend to keep pumping for as long as they continue to do so. And they would prefer to defer that cost as long as possible, says Greg Rogers, who's an attorney and accountant who studies oil infrastructure and decommissioning. However, if possible, sometimes oil companies pass off those obligations like a hot potato, with fossil fuel giants like ExxonMobil selling offshore rigs on partially depleted fields to smaller wildcat operators like Platform Holly's Veneco, which try to extract as much money as they can out of the leftover assets. But when the decommissioning bill comes due, those small companies can declare bankruptcy and they let taxpayers clean up their mess, as Veneco has. Some environmentalists say that state and federal governments should cancel oil companies' leases outright, but such moves would inevitably wind up in court, where the public attorneys would likely have to prove that each individual rig in question is threatening the citizens' health and safety. This is what Rob Schuwerk, who's an attorney and executive director of Carbon Tracker North America, and he studies fossil fuel investments and climate change. This is what he had said. "I would imagine that it would be difficult, but in California, Lucchese, who's of the State Lands Commission, says it would likely be illegal for her agency to end existing oil leases. Yanking the leases out of oil companies' hands would require new legislation, and the tactic would leave California open to massive lawsuits. Now, the oil companies do have a vested contractual rights in these leases," she says. Some advocates say that battle is worth fighting. They are taking risks within the whole state's economic well-being, and that's not even counting the human health. This is what Richard Charter, who's a senior fellow at the Ocean Foundation, says, and Robert Hertzberg, who he leads the Democratic majority in California State Senate. He has proposed a softer tactic modifying the 2010 Rigs to Reef law to change the underlying incentives at play. This law would allow the oil companies to leave much of their platforms underwater structure in place when they decommission the rigs. Now, if they can prove doing so would offer a net environmental benefit to sea life, Herzenberg said that working that particular law to streamline the approval process and let oil companies keep more of the cost savings from leaving parts of the rigs in place would encourage operators to shut down platforms rather than sell them. As much as you want to stop drilling offshore, there's still the rights of the people with oil and the lawsuits and all the headaches, says Hertzberg. Rigs to Reefs creates an incentive model to get them to do what they want. But the environmental advocates are dubious about claims that leaving massive underwater structures in place could benefit the ocean. Some say it may increase the risk of future leaks. It's just another example of the oil industry externalizing their costs and dumping all of this waste into the ocean and just leaving it out there. This is what Kristen Mansell, who's an ocean program litigation director at the Center for Biological Diversity, had said. Indeed, much of the regulatory architecture surrounding the U.S. oil sector was originally designed not to limit fossil fuel extraction, but to maximize it. That meant granting substantial legal rights to oil companies, and those rights are now difficult to claw back. Now, that's why the state of California is now paying contractors $250,000 a week to vent poison gas from an abandoned oil rig off Santa Barbara, and why it's so hard to get rid of the old, what they call unpopular oil infrastructure, like the pipeline that spewed crude oil over some of the country's most prized coastlines last week. It brought wealth and jobs and taxes and economic growth, but no one cared really about shutting all this fucking shit down, Roger says, and that was a problem for future generations. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when the new video comes out, and thanks for listening.